It was a damp and giggly trio who returned with the water, me with my trousers drying in the sun after a turn at the pump. We were met by a group of uniformly tall, gaunt, and severe looking men, some wives eyeing the blonde Marungu and uh, Tete Tendai. We discovered that Sakuru had been busy. These were family members he had gathered together, and discussions began. As soon as Tendai's namesake and great aunt saw me, she let out a shrill screech and began dancing in circles that belied her first impression as a frail old lady. We were instant friends. She reached up and placed one arm on my shoulder, and the other grasped my right hand in a vice-like grip. Dragging me along, while still dancing and ululating loudly, she brought me into the center of the circle, gave me a huge grin, and handed me over to Sakuru and ran off laughing to join her niece. Tendai emerged from the hut, a wrap covering her legs instead of city clothes, and she joined me at my side. She introduced me to each of the men first, explaining who the uncles were and who were only cousins. The uncles, I knew, were the ones who would be deciding our future. Tendai clapped hands and curtsied as she shook hands with the elders. I followed suit, placing my hand on the forearm, though failing to distinguish between the ones who merited this subtle deference from the cousins who merely required an informal hand slap. We all sat down. So, Gafford, began Sakuru, tell us why you have come to see us. Okay, I thought, let's not cut to the chase right away. Tendai, seated on the mat beside me, spoke out in Shona before I had a time to marshal my thoughts. This is my husband, she said, and he wishes to honor our family by showing respect to my parents. This is why he has come. As you know, in Zimbabwe, it is possible for people to get married before a magistrate, and that is what we did already. Now we have come to have a traditional wedding with my family. It was very bold for a young woman to speak like this. However, she was her mother's daughter, and everyone was well aware how Sakuru listened to his diminutive wife. Conversation quickly turned to me, and those who spoke enough English asked me about my parents and my homeland. They were confused about me being a Canadian, yet my mother lived in England. They also felt sorry for me that I had only one brother and that he too lived in England. I had to explain about the passing of my father at an early age and how I had gone to see my Canadian relatives and ended up staying in Canada. It all seemed so ridiculously complicated to them, but they were glad that my elder brother was looking after my mother. They were amazed to hear that Tendai had already met her new mother, and I could hear the cash registers going off in the brains of some of the relatives. Lobola, or bride price, was something that I had known about since my first arrival. We were making them more valuable, Captain Carlson had advised me in my first week at Bradley School. With each certificate they get, their lobola increases by 2 cattle. It was a bit cynical, but largely accurate. My relationship with Tendai had begun with me trying to help her with rewrites of her exams, as she had only passed one of 6 courses. At Chindanduma, I had been teaching Pride and Prejudice to my A-level students and had intentionally gone to great pains to explain the concept of dowry to Tendai. She was familiar with the benefits of ready cash and realized that paying large sums of money to her family, as was the practice with Lobola, meant having less for her to spend on what she wanted. She took some pains to inform the gathered relatives of the customs and expectations of white culture over marriage. Ray has come here to honor our culture and our family, she concluded, looking at her father. I noticed that Tete Tendai had also paid close attention. She looked in my direction and gave me a huge shy smile. At this point, I was no longer needed, so I was free to wander and explore while they went about their business in hand. For the remainder of the morning, I was taken on a tour of the area by the children. They took me down to the dried riverbed that marked the boundary of Sakuru's farm, crossing over fields of maize, pumpkins, groundnuts, sorghum, and cotton. The addition of the large leafy plants around the maize enabled the ground to retain the moisture by shielding it from the direct rays of the sun. Sakura had also been prudent in planting sorghum, as it was the hardier stock, and if drought hit the area, it was prone to doing as it was prone to doing every seventh year. At least he would be able to harvest a small amount of the food to sustain the family. The dried riverbed meandered and twisted its way down to the tributary of the Misungesi River, one of dozens that flowed down the escarpment behind us, and which all ended up feeding the mighty Zambezi some 60 kilometers to the north. The south tributary was a lazy brown stream, only a few meters wide, and I was tempted to jump on a fallen tree that appeared to have been deliberately pushed across to create a small makeshift bridge. No, no! Mirai grabbed my arm and pulled me back. The children pointed at what looked like a piece of driftwood floating nearby. Two small bumps on the log made a tiny movement. Crocodile! Big crocodile! Eat you! I really was in another world now, and even though I had spent 3 years in the rural areas around Madziwa, I had always lived on school compounds where safe fences had kept much of the raw Africa out. As if to prove to me what an amateur I really was, two lanky young men scrambled across the tree from the other side, two bottles of moonshine in either hand. See, they seemed to be saying to me, this is how it is done. Ah, you are such a child. The bottles gave me an idea. I turned to my little entourage, which had now grown with the arrival of a couple of Simbi's curious little friends. You like Fanta, yes? I asked, and there was an enthusiastic nodding of heads and the biggest smiles as we climbed up the steep bank to join the main road that had carried Tendai and myself to the village only a few hours earlier. The walk to the Huata store felt as if I was traveling along a small tributary that soon merged into a larger river. The closer we came to the store, the greater the number of bodies of all sizes and shapes that joined us. Some of them were carrying bags of roasted maize cobs to sell to the drinkers at the store. Others carried heavier bags of dried maize for the grinding mill. Most were carrying empty bottles, which would be exchanged for new ones: Fanta, Coke, Castle beer, even clear bottles for paraffin or cooking oil. The store was audible well before it could be picked out from amongst the shade trees which grew around it and afforded the customers comfortable shadows to linger during the heat of the day. Tinny sounds of Paul Mataviri, Thomas Mfumu, or the Brothers Four crackled from the speakers, strung by wires from the radio set on the window ledge. On weekends, I later discovered, this served as a local sporting arena. The radio would blare out the details of the latest clash between Black Rhinos and Air Force in the faraway stadia in the larger urban centers. Every young boy, his feet bare and the ball nothing more than a bundle of tied plastic shopping bags, dreamed big of playing for Zimbabwe at the African Cup of Nations and being scouted to play for Liverpool or Manchester United. The crowd would gather religiously during the season to listen, and when a goal was scored, dancing would sweep through the supporting faction while the opposition poured scorn on the hapless defender who had failed in his duty. I gave Mirai some money to purchase drinks or freezes for all the children while I waited outside. A young policeman, eyes red from too much celebrating the previous night, sauntered over to me. Rather than standing a polite distance away from me and greeting me respectfully, he was aggressive and confrontational. What are you doing here? Why are you in this place? It was an edge of hostility and suspicion that I had become somewhat used to at roadblocks in the past. This was a land where the emergency powers had remained fresh and energetic long after the transfer of power from the former colonial masters who had been made to the majority African government. It irritated and still rankled, and I had seen Chris Rose, Prof as we called him, being hauled off and interrogated for 7 hours by the security forces after he had been seen drawing a marking grid for the stack of exams he was about to go through. He had been seated in a public bar in Bindora, and the CIOs suspected that he was drawing a plan to the hotel and aiming to kill the president who would be arriving in town on the next afternoon. "Good morning, how are you?" I asked him in my best imitation of Shona. I reached out and gave the surprised policeman the triple handshake, holding onto his hand and continuing, "Are we brothers? Is this your home area too?" A broad grin spread across the face of the young man, but he shook his hand free. "What are you meaning? I have never seen you here before." "Ah, this is my first time to come here," I answered. "My wife is from here. She was one of the ones who went out during the war, and I am here with her little brothers and sisters." "We have no white families living here." But before he could finish, Mirai came out and asked me if I wanted Coke or Fanta. "This is your sister? Is your wife a black person? Is it possible? I used to shoot people like you. And I used to teach people like you at Chindanduma, former soldiers." "You are a teacher? Where are you from?" He dropped the military posture and became a young man again. "I'm a Canadian teacher. I came here to teach you how to play football." I slapped his hand and we both laughed. "Canada! Ha ha! They can't play football. They should never have been in the World Cup. We Zimbabweans, we could have beaten them 10-0. What are they doing there? Nothing." A small group of bystanders stood around listening and soon threw in their cents worth, most of them agreeing that Kenneth Kaunda's team from neighboring Zambia were going to be the next African champions. Much later, the children and I retraced our steps, carrying with us drinks for the other members of the family. I was very aware that I was being the big spender and should be careful not to set up expectations. But for now, I was a little less strange and somewhat more human to youngsters who, for the most part, had never had any real social contact with Marungu in their lives. The whites that they had seen before were mostly authority figures, some even army or policemen with guns who had threatened and scared them. However, the heat, the jet lag, and the lack of sleep hit me hard. Barely able to keep my eyes open, I made my way across the compound to Tendai and soon fell into a deep sleep inside the storage hut, my head resting on a pile of rolled clothes and that were needing to be washed. In the meantime, the family had been busy. That annoying young black goat, which had been bothering the chickens and licking the pots that were needing to be washed, had been taken behind the kraal and dispatched, skinned, skewered, ready for the feast that was in the making. More water was fetched, while Amai Livison painstakingly grated some maize on a sort of washboard, using a stone to turn it into a fine white mush. The traditional sadzo or maize meal was usually pounded in a hollow log, pestle and mortar style, and even though it too was a laborious assignment, the task facing Tendai's mother would take her the greater part of the afternoon. The men had met. Uncle Fadzai wanted a minimum of 2 cattle, which he would have been happy to gather up. Sekuru, however, was the one who understood the delicacy of the situation. He was aware that I was, at least at the present time, unemployed and may need to fly home. Would I be able to afford to take my bride, or would I just leave her, damaged goods as she might end up, and subsequently hard to marry off at all. He was a prudent man, tall but without formal education past grade 5. His ability to harvest in years when others were starving had earned him a reputation as an expert farmer. Sakura also understood that Europeans had a different approach to marriage, and he had listened to his daughter. 2 goats, Tendai had said as I emerged from a deep, restful sleep. So, you must give me $80 to buy them. You are cheap. I told you to study harder, I replied mockingly. You must pay father now so we can pay for the goats and get them ready to be presented at the feast. I dug into my wallet and extracted the bills and handed them over to her. There's just one more thing. Do you like eating raw goat intestines? I could tell from the way that Tendai was looking at me that she was not joking. Not so much. Why? The groom must eat some. It is part of our culture. What if I gag? That must not happen. Don't worry. You aren't marrying me. I will be marrying my cousin. She looked at me with a poker-straight face. What? What are you talking about? I had already lost my job, and I was now about to lose my bride of the past 9 months. I blanched and wobbled, not quite sure what to make of things. He is going to substitute for you. I saw her brilliant smile as she, obviously enjoying the moment, continued. You will have to remain in the hut while the ceremony is taking place, otherwise the ancestors may interfere. And we wouldn't want that, I said, with images of the Disney cartoon Sleeping Beauty, where the little fairy godmothers circled over the head of the sleeping princess. I left, and she left, and I remained in the hut while my wife married her cousin. I missed out on the ceremony, so I never saw what had taken place, which is a bit of an odd thing to say about the day one gets married. After the ceremony was over, I was invited to cross the compound to the main hut where everyone was gathered. Sakura made a speech in Shona with Tendai translating. He spoke of welcoming me into the family and that this place would be like my own home. I would be taking their child away from them. They thanked me for being respectful by coming to see them and for agreeing to honor their custom of paying lobola. They hoped we would bring their grandchildren to come and see them and that there would be many of them. Then it was my turn. This wasn't the sort of thing that I had a lot of experience with, so it was with some trepidation that I rose to respond. I wish to thank you for letting me marry your child, and I promise I will do my best to protect her and any children we may have. In my culture, it is normal for both parents, for the parents of both the husband and the wife to be equal in importance. I understand that in your culture, once a girl leaves her parents, she becomes the daughter of the husband's family, and she leaves her own parents behind. For as long as I am in Africa, I would like to ask you to be my parents, that I might be like your own son. I will do my best to help the family and will visit often. I didn't add that I had no clue where I should be living and how I would manage to do what I was promising, but this was Africa, Hakuna Matata. I was aware that school fees were paid whenever the harvests permitted. Too soon, I had seen students with the telltale reddening of the hair and the dry skin, early symptoms of malnutrition during the years of drought. Educating the children was a matter of pride as well as the hope that one day there would be wage earners in the family to support them and perhaps even help them build a cinder block house. My arrival in the family could make a significant difference to their well-being, and I intended to help out, to do my share, even though as yet I was still a stranger. I returned to the storage hut and went back to sleep. Outside, Tendai married her cousin, and there were speeches and songs that I snoozed obliviously through. It was one of the rare occasions where it didn't matter that I wasn't present at my own wedding. Things worked out fine. Later, I was invited to join the activities, and I became a mukwasha. I ate the most delicious sadza I had ever come across, mixed with groundnut paste, and even found myself liking the freshly cooked goat livers. My new Vatijara joined in the dancing under the bright moon that night, and when the huge long life battery finally expired, I retired to the boys' side of the compound, and Tendai joined her sisters on the other side. And I promised myself that next time I came, if I could, I would bring a tent and a foam rubber mattress.